So let's get started, shall we? I just wanted to cover some housekeeping rules. If you have any questions during the program, please feel free to write them in the Q&A section. I will try to intersperse your questions throughout the conversation. And we'll also reserve some time at the end of the conversation for a Q&A. Now, let me introduce everyone to Jessica Pearce Rotondi. Jessica Pearce Rotondi is the author of What We Inherit, A Secret War and a Family Search for Answers, the true story of her family's 36-year search to bring a missing son home from the CIA-led war in Laos. Salman Rushdie called it exceptional, and the Oprah Magazine named it a best book of summer 2020. Jessica's work has been published by the History Channel, Reader's Digest, the Boston Globe, Refinery 29, Salon, and Vogue, and featured by NBC and CNN. She is chair of Legacies Library at Legacies of War and the recipient of a 2024 Poet and Author Fellowship from the Martha's Vineyard Creative Writing Institute. She has studied at the Bread Loaf Writers Conference, Siren Land, and Lighthouse Writers Workshop. Jessica grew up in New England and is a graduate of Brown University. She lives locally in New Jersey with her partner and two young sons and is currently at work on her debut novel about the ripple effects of a flood on a close-knit island community. You can connect with Jessica on Twitter and Instagram at Jessica Rotondi or visit jessicapiercerotondi.com. Welcome, Jessica. Thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Thank you so much for having me, Kim. It's an honor to be here.
Yes, it's wonderful. Jessica, everyone, I would just say Jessica and I were having heart to heart at the beginning of this, and I was just telling her that my family is facing a cancer diagnosis of my mother-in-law, who was recently diagnosed a month ago, just shockingly so, out of the blue. And while I've read What We Inherit months ago, I reread it during this last month, and I've just seen it with like a different lens, given my experience this past month. Jessica, could you go into a little bit about your discovery of your uncle's story and just take us back, I guess, to the opening of this book and where you were then and what you were thinking?
Sure. Do you want me to open by maybe reading a passage from that section and then we can go through it together?
Yes, that'd be beautiful.
So this is actually a couple hours after my mother passed away. I'm going back into her room, looking for a note from her, some kind of message that she knew this was going to happen because none of my family really saw it coming. And then I find something else, which is how this book, What We Inherit, actually exists. So here we are, October 29th, 2009. I head for the bedroom where my mother spent the last summer of her life and swing open the door. The indent of Mom's head is still pressed into the pillow. A few silver hairs float up like dandelion bracts in the stale air, vibrating with my breath. Books are stacked along the floor on her side of the bed, the contents of all the packages I sent that she will never read. I step over the books and reach for the closet door. When I flip the switch, the shadows flee from Mom's dresses, their emptiness more pronounced in the harsh light. I run my hands over her things, the sheets of thin dry cleaner's plastic clinging to my arms like I clung to hers only hours before in the hospice bed. I reach for Mom's red coat at the back of the closet and my hand bumps up against something hard. Pulling aside her silk blouses and creased wool pants, I uncover an old filing cabinet shoved against the wall. The shelves rock but don't budge when I pull at the handle of the cabinet's top drawer. I tug harder, knuckles whitening, knocking her coat to the floor. When the drawer finally jerks open, it's easy to see why it had been stuck shut. It's filled to bursting with newspaper clippings. I pull out a stack and see my grandparents' faces over and over, headlines screaming for their son. Stalag 17 survivor wages 10-year battle to learn fate of MIA son. Families work with belief that MIAs are still alive in Asia. Milford man goes to Laos in search of missing son. MIA father keeps the faith. There are quotes from Mom in these pages, photos of her holding signs about her missing brother as she marches on Washington. How had I never seen these before? My fingers shake as I put the newspaper clippings aside and reach into the drawer again, pulling up a thick scrapbook. Inside, its pages are filled with headshots of young men with stiff Air Force hats clamped to their heads, their newly buzzed hair just visible above formal collars. Some gaze at the camera confidently, their broad shoulders filling the frame, while others appear too young for the uniforms buttoned around their necks. Under every face is the exhortation, "Where is he?" My Uncle Jack's face is on page 3. I've only seen 2 photos of Jack in my entire life and know exactly that number of things about him. That he was named after his father and that, like his father, he joined the Air Force and was shot down. The only difference was that Jack never came home. Page after page of heavily censored documents bear my uncle's name. I spread them out across the floor, shoving Mom's shoes aside in the process. The pages are covered in CIA stamps and tantalizing black bars as thick as the silence between Mom and me when it came to her missing brother. The closest I thought I'd been to the CIA was watching spy movies on TV. I never dreamed that there were a stash of declassified files hidden in my childhood home. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. It sounds like it was such a shock um, for you to experience this discovery. Could you go back to that day and could you trace that moment to the moment where you realized that you wanted to share your story?
Absolutely. I don't think it was as linear as wanting to write the book and knowing it in that moment, but there were very much the seeds of that desire to have this story told. I think, yeah, the silence, those black bars on that paper, I just felt like my own history, my own family was being covered up from me. And there was that extra layer of my mother's own silence about it. This had been a huge part of her life. She lost Jack at the age I lost her. So in my grief and struggle to understand if she knew she was going to leave me, what I should do without her, what the rest of my life would look at. What I got instead was the chance to kind of meet her at my age, because that was the age where she kind of became a woman who had lost someone, much like I became a young woman who had lost someone. That early 20s mindset where you're, early adulthood, but you're not still over a lot of the emotions of childhood. Everything just feels raw and new. It's first love, it's first loss. And through her search for Jack, I was kind of able to find my way both back to her and also into that forward motion of finding myself. It was a map through grief that I never expected to find, but one that gave me a sense of purpose to kind of complete the work that she had started looking for Jack.
You had mentioned that you had only heard about your Uncle Jack several times before this. When you found this information, did a light bulb go off? Did everything start to make sense? Or did it just become even more of a conundrum?
Yeah, I mean, there were photos of him in my grandmother's house. I knew my mom had 4 brothers growing up. She was the only girl, and they were all these, bright-eyed boys with freckles and kind of stuffy hair. But, his photos stopped at a certain age, and most of the ones that were of him in adulthood were in this very stiff uniform, kind of like those boys I had mentioned in that passage. And it wasn't the easy smile of brothers holding each other or being together. It was this little boy trying to look like a man almost. And I think so much about Jack trying to emulate his father. My grandfather was in World War II. He parachuted out of a B-17, survived that incredible fall to live in a prison camp and come back home. And because he had done that and was lauded as a hero in World War II, Jack joined the Air Force as well, but during a very different era, during the Vietnam War era, when I think service and the reason for service was not as clear cut as it was for us in World War II. And when he was shot down, the difference was he never came home. And then the government had also just moved on by that time. So there wasn't an easy way for my family to get answers about what had happened to him. It was a war that America lost. And so there's still people missing in Laos and Vietnam from that on both sides that have not been discovered. And so um, I think Jack wanted to try to repeat history in much the same way I kind of wanted to be my mother. I wanted to be like her, feel close to her. But we really can never become the people that we love. We have to kind of become our own person. That's part of growing up. Jack never got to grow up. And in some sense, I did through witnessing um, that kind of cut off of the family branch in my tree from a very close and grief-filled perspective, unfortunately.
Yes.
It's a very long answer.
Yeah. It's okay. It's all right. Um, it's interesting because you're following these paths through these files, these found objects, so to speak. You mentioned um, a memory where you discover a gift from your Uncle Jack to your mother, this lovely ruby ring. I think it was garnet, actually. Garnet ring. It was a red ring. And you talk about discovering your uncle's dog tags. How did these objects affect you and what role did they play in your writing?
Yeah, you'll notice throughout the book as well, I also include photos of a lot of these kind of found objects. For me, they were almost talismans into the people that I missed and loved. I didn't know we had Jack's dog tags. I was in my apartment in Brooklyn where my desk was basically my bed because my apartment was this big. I was just, it was early in the morning before I went to work. I was just covered in filing cabinets. I was opening a new box, brought a new manila folder covered in dust onto my bed, very sanitary. Opened it up and something cold and metallic fell on my lap. And it was Jack's dog tags. It was, the last thing that was physically around his body and his neck. It was something I learned through the paper trail my grandfather had held, my mother had clearly held. And when you lose someone, I think that sense of touch is one of the things I at least miss the most. So having something to hold on to run my thumb over, to hold in my very hands felt different to me than all that paper and all that longing. It really brought it to bear in a very physical way where I kind of felt the shock of it. It was almost like a time travel machine where the emotion was like a live current for me holding that. So I tried to bring that for the reader as well. You'll see pages of CIA documents. You'll see my grandfather's World War II prisoner of war card, because I think that's when history came alive for me, and I hope it does for my readers as well, to connect to this family.
Your story is very interesting in the format, the alternating timeline, the quotes from your family members. How did it start? How did that format come into being? Did you always envision it as this amalgamation of memoir, investigative journalism, and history, or was it different when it started?
When I first started this thing, I was a journalist and I was not at all recovered from grief. Not that anyone can recover from grief, but I was like, I'm going to do this like a journalist and make an investigative report and stick to the facts, no emotion, no direct connection. But of course, that's impossible. I'm writing about my own family. So the first draft was very cold. I think I had an over 200-page just timeline of typed up segments from these documents. There were so many phrases, like the transcript from the trial where the Air Force tried to declare my uncle dead, that I had to include. I had to include. And then when I actually stepped back and read it, I was like, this is interesting to me because it's my family, but anyone else is not going to care about this. Where's the heart? Where's the emotion of it? And I spent 10 years writing this book, Kim, and I think a big part of that was
Wow.
growing into myself as a writer, but also growing into the kind of writer this story very much needed. The book is told from two perspectives. It's from my perspective the day my mom passes away, through my trip to Southeast Asia in search of Jack's crash site and answers. And then it's my grandfather waking up in the 1970s, looking and looking for his son. So it's a father looking for his son, a daughter looking for her mother. And I realized that was kind of the beating heart of it for me. It wasn't this fact-based finding mission. There are many beautiful nonfiction books and academic books, which I'll talk more about later in the segment, that I would refer people to learn about the war in Laos. But for me, the beating heart of this was a father looking for his son and a mother and daughter relationship. And that's where I decided to kind of pivot to those two threads, which is not the most marketable or saleable thing in the world if you're trying to approach big publishers. But I work with Unnamed Press and they were excited to take a chance on a very kind of experimental format. And it worked beautifully, I think. And I was really happy with the faith my editor, Olivia, had in writing a story kind of in this unique way.
Well, the parallels worked very well when you talk about your grandfather looking for your Uncle Jack and you searching for your mother, and what her life must have been when she lost your Uncle Jack.
And there's a
So,
countdown I included to kind of clarify for readers. I think when you're going back and forth in time, it's very important to guide your readers and kind of cement them in the time, but it's the number of days since Jack has been missing. And then my chapters are the number of days since I've lost my mother. That countdown felt very, very important to me to create that sense of, from the first page, that my uncle is dead or that he's missing. So I needed to create that sense of beating time and beating her, which I hope I was able to achieve through that.
We have one of our attendees has a question. How long did you stay in the closet the day you found the filing cabinet?
Oh my God. I think I had maybe slept an hour or two the night before. I had rushed in from New York City. I don't that time in my life, I was awake, it was asleep, it was planning a funeral. I don't know. I think in the moment, it had to be less than an hour because I had to go back downstairs. My aunt was waiting for me. I went into that closet to find something to bury her in. Yeah, not long, but I came back to it again and again and again. And when I was ready, and I think the crazy thing about this story taking 10 years, it was almost like it was meant to be that way because every now and then I would just find something when I most needed it. This is going to sound a little crazy, but yeah, when I was really missing mom, I was having a really hard day and a personal issue in a relationship, and that's kind of the day that I found the dog tags. And later on, when the book deal happened and then fell through, it happened and fell through. There was just a lot of moments where um, it didn't all come cohere. There were a lot of times where I didn't think it would ever happen, and taking my time with those documents and revisiting them, kind of like you revisited the book, I think things resonate differently with time and distance. There's a very common advice if you're writing a memoir or writing about grief, don't write when it's fresh, wait. Um, I didn't wait initially, but thank God it took me very long to actually get publication because I think it's a very different project than it would have been if I had just emotionally reacted to those papers in that moment.
Wow. How different do you think it would have been? Like, in what way?
I I hadn't processed anything. I was 23 years old and I was just sad, and I couldn't see my life beyond losing her. Like, part of the reason I went to Laos and walked over ground like laden with bombs is because I don't think I cared at some level if I had lived or died. I think there was this sense of the worst thing that is ever going to happen to me happened to me, and I can't be hurt anymore. There was this sense of like almost superhuman bravado, which is clearly very flawed and not actually true. But in that early 20 stage, I wasn't ready to open up myself to be heard again. And I think writing this book, you had to kind of reopen yourself to feeling those feelings in order to come out the other side.
You talked to many people in the process of writing this book. And I know you mentioned talking to your Uncle Kim. Um, did you talk to any of your other family members? Did you talk to your father? Were there things that people, I mean, I'm just coming at from the standpoint of, family, but at any point did you wonder, oh, maybe other people in the family know things I don't? Um, and maybe I'm the only one that's been kept in the dark or, you know?
Absolutely. That was a big tension for me was, am I asking my family to relive some of their darkest days? Is it selfish of me to go there with them? Like, my dad is not okay. He's grieving. How do I ask him about mom in this moment when it's so fresh for him? And I think what I came to find was when it was in a space where I told him, hey, I'd like to ask you this type of questions. Is there a time that's good for you where we could both get in that headspace where we're going to go to this place? But we know we're going to come back. There's an hour lemonade or something. We could then get through it. My sister was already living abroad at the time. So it was really hard. I do kind of mention the early loneliness in the book of my family just kind of fracturing after mom died. I think we all kind of went our separate ways for a little while because we weren't okay. But through the book, my dad went to so many events. My sister has been such a supporter of it. I think it really, at least for me, reunited a lot of my fears around dragging people through things because coming out the other side of it now, people who never met mom know her name. They know Jack's name, and hearing them spoken aloud in other rooms makes me feel like a part of them are still with me and with my family as well. So that's been really powerful.
I imagine this book was very healing for you to write for 10 years.
Maybe my 20s could have been a little happier and a little brighter. I'm so proud of it, and it was something I had to do, and I had my babies after writing this book. I obviously became an author because of this book, but it almost felt like my life was on hold until this project could be seen to fruition, until I could complete my grandfather and my mother's work. I very much saw it as a continuation of this drive.
Wonderful. Do you feel, I think there's a common theme with a lot of a lot of books I've read, and I've talked to others who talk about their family secrets.
Mm.
Um, and I guess things that happened in the past that people don't want to uncover, and they don't want to put their children um, and the next generation through the same thing. Um, through your process, and this is a big question, how do you think we can, I guess, cope from, I guess, generational trauma?
Mm. Oh, I mean, I'm a firm believer in a good therapist. Therapist at the end of the book. Yeah, I think this is such an incredible generation. My good friend Sahej Kohli wrote a book. Her whole media platform is called Brown Girl Therapy, and the book is called What Will People Say? And she's a first generation Indian American woman, a Sikh American woman. And she is now a practicing therapist. We used to work together at HuffPost. Now she does therapy specifically for first gen people in the United States. And her writing is just, it's so powerful. It kind of balances this fear of harming and disrespecting. I think the idea of respect and silence equaling respect is so ingrained in cultures across the board, right? But especially perhaps maybe East Asian and South Asian, like my husband's culture and like Sahesh's culture. And I think um, a lot of the work of breaking the trauma is breaking the silence around it. But with the caveat that we can't force people to change or talk. It's a survival method for so long for so many.
Yeah,
It's a privilege to be raised in a country where you can speak your mind. I mean, in Laos, it was actually illegal to talk about the war in certain ways. People were jailed months before I was there for covering it. Um, yeah, I think it's meeting people where they are. Not everyone is going to be able to tell you everything, but if you can get even a little closer to your roots and where you come from, it'd be so healing. And I encourage everyone here to check out a group called Legacies of War. I used to be a trustee. I still had their library program, and it's a group of Lao American women running this amazing nonprofit that advocates for the removal of the bombs. But also, our mission is Legacies, History, Healing, Hope. So, telling the story of the war through really talking about it. A lot of the employees, their parents came here because of the war. They did not really talk about it until they were in their late teens, early 20s, when it became something that they needed to know about to understand their parents, but also themselves and their place in this dark history. To live in a country that once attacked your mother or your father's family of origin is a very complicated. Anyway, yeah.
yeah, yeah. I have a quote here from your book, and it struck me. My bedroom back home has become a museum to mom's letters. And I remember thinking to myself, because reading through this book, there's just so much information.
Mhm.
It's your family history, but it's history as well. Could you go into a little bit about your writing process? I always ask writers about their writing process. And I think that it's so interesting because, again, your book is a combination of different genres and different um, writing styles morphed together. So what is your writing process? What's your day to day?
Don't recommend it. It was just, I mean, it was like thousands of pages of documents that took me 2 years to go through. I would, if anything was really arresting, I would take a photograph or type it up just to get it in the timeline. And then I had to sync my grandfather's timeline. I actually went through my mom's medical records, sunk up the timeline. When did she find the tumor? When was her first radiation? When was the chemo? Which actually a lot of that isn't even in the book. It was just helpful to me to understand her state of mind when she received certain documents from the Air Force. Um, and then just when I was actually in Laos, and I encourage anyone who travels to just take a very detailed journal and a lot of photographs. Like a lot of my photos were literally just like close-ups of the soil or like the steam coming off of a rice field because I wanted to remember the setting and the feeling of it more than take a pretty photo. It was kind of being able to return to something in a sensory way for me as a writer enables me to then enter it in a mental way. But I kind of have to set that scene up for myself first. And then my main day job now is writing for the History Channel. So I have a very strong history focus and writing about the war in Laos. I knew not a lot of Americans are familiar with it. I certainly never learned about it in school. We barely touched on Vietnam. So for me, it was also important that I include this history without being didactic about it. And one of the ways I did, I wrote a scene where I go through a history museum where I can then touch upon the history, get the reader excited about it, include some very strong visuals. And a crazy story about that is there's one scene later in the book where I'm at the Cope Visit Center in Vientiane, which is a center where they talk about the effects of the bombing, mainly through the lens of the way bodies are still being harmed today. Like 50 people a year are still being damaged by these bombs that we dropped 50 years ago. And there's like prosthetics hanging from the wall. It's a very heavy place, especially going in there as the niece of someone dropping these bombs. It was very emotional, as it should be. And one of the things I found, that they had drawings from survivors of the bombings, hand-drawn images of craters. I mean, it's very deep and disturbing. It's done in crayon, but you're seeing a lot of gore. And then there was translated descriptions of a first-person interview. I found out years later these papers are now in the possession of Legacies of War, which I now work for
Wow.
this organization. But those were some of the papers that I think really clicked for me. I need to write about this now, and not just from this American-centered perspective. I need to do all the work I can to be an ally, to surface the Lao American experience as much as I can, and point readers towards books that speak to all sides of this conflict and not just the American military one, because it's so complex. And there were so many families that were just ripped apart in the Lao government and the US government and in my own family. It just, there's so much to explore. I barely touched the surface, but I did want to include that background and that structure, so people excited to learn more about the war would be able to then reach through and find out more.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because a couple of years ago, we featured a book, a graphic novel called The Best We Could Do by Thi Bui. And that was about the author's experience as a Vietnamese refugee, but more so about her family and trying to understand her parents, because when she uh, came here, she was so young, she couldn't remember. And it opened up all these conversations about the Vietnam War. And um, I myself am the child of two Vietnamese refugees. And when you're a child of Vietnamese refugees, or even of the military, as you've shown, there's so much to unpack. There's so much to try to understand. And it's so conflicted. There's so much um, to try to understand. And you don't almost want to take sides. You're trying to just take it all in, and it's so much more complicated. So how do you, all of this to say, how did you react when you were in Laos as the 20-something-year-old and facing this for the first time, this part of history? And how did you reconcile that with your uncle's role and the American role in this?
That's an incredibly complex and very thoughtful question. I wanted to thank you too for sharing your own family's story with us. I think that's something that is incredibly powerful, to be grounded in talking about this war in that way, with a deeply personal involvement. I had done a lot of research on the war, but nothing prepared me for actually going to Laos. When we got to the town my uncle was bombing the night he was shot down, um, and this is a scene in the book too, there was a bunch of school kids that were just getting out of school. They were running towards us and laughing and smiling. My friend Liz and I and my guide. And I had this entire sinking feeling in my stomach, like if they knew who I was, if they knew where I come from, they would run in the other direction. There was a pair of Superman pajamas hanging on a laundry line over another bomb crater that was maybe 25, 30 feet into the ground in front of someone's house. And, this symbol of like American heroism, and this like person that's going to fix and save the world is strewn over this pockmark that took out houses, people, cattle, livelihoods. And again, these bombs are still killing people today. The bombs that were cluster bombs, they're not designed to all go off at once. They can go in the ground and be viable 50, 100 years more. And there's still a huge problem. People lighting up camping fires, digging in their own property in their rice fields. It's mainly children too, because they look like this big. They're like little metal balls. And it's such a horrifying thing, because like the war is not over for the people in Laos. Like, people don't invest in that country. People are afraid to send their children out to play because their bodies can be ripped apart by something that happened 50 years ago. It's not in the past. It's not like we're moving on to the next war, the next conflict. It's still very much part of daily life. And feeling that by standing in front of those craters was something that I'll never forget for the rest of my life. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a sense of responsibility, even if you didn't live it
Hmm.
as a child, a relation of someone from the past, of your family. I know for me, what you described reminds me of when I was a little kid. I was I think about 6, and we had a Vietnam vet come visit us in school, and he was a paraplegic. And I don't think my teachers at that time knew like that my parents were Vietnamese refugees, but I remember the fear I felt that this Vietnam vet would blame me for what happened to him as a child. So there's this, I think this and what you said when you just said that you thought these kids would run the opposite direction if they knew. And I think that's something that I can definitely relate to, where you weren't even a part of it, but you feel that you were because it's a part of your family.
And I think touching on what you said before, intergenerational trauma, there is a part of our genes that did experience this from one side or the other. And so I think
Yeah.
there's deep-rooted primal sense of remembered but no longer accessible memory of these experiences. And I think for me, the biggest thing was I can't change the past. I can't go back in time and rip them off the plane. I can't fix the ground on the floor now, but what I can do is go home and make sure that the rest of the country knows what happened here. Do my best to be an ally and to get the story of what America did out there, and do some fundraising to get rid of these bombs and just tell this story over and over. I talk about the bombings a lot, but I also do a lot of events with veterans. I went to DC a couple of months ago on behalf of Legacies of War. There's something called the National League of Families, and it's those moms, mainly moms and sisters now, more sisters and wives actually, because a lot of the moms have passed on, like my grandmother, still waiting for news. They still have people that are missing. And yeah, there's a lot of pain in that room. And it was adult daughters now in their 40s and 50s who never really met their dads. And it is this strange thing that we're still through stories reliving that pain, yes, but I think being in that room, the biggest emotion, I actually started crying on stage when I was trying to do a normal presentation, was because I could feel the emotions of that room. It can be incredibly healing to tell a story out loud in a room full of people that get it. And I think that's something I encourage anyone with a complicated family history to explore, is like, where can you find other people that have been through a similar thing, and what can you learn? If your own family is not accessible to you, um, how can you find your community and do something about it?
Yes, that's beautifully said. We have a question from Donald. Um, Donald is wondering how, I guess, he's wondering um, why you believe your uncle was motivated to accept his mission. And I know
Mhm.
in the book you talked a little bit about some of his experiences and how he came back different. Could you elaborate from what you learned?
So dark. Yeah. He was just haunted. He wanted to be a gunner just like daddy on that B-17, but that wasn't an option in these AC-130s. The planes he were flying were gunships. They were huge, open to the air, low flying. He basically was just what they call kind of a grunt, essentially. Like he was just like loading the ammo in, and it was very physical labor, but there wasn't any pointing, any aiming. It was um, not as prestigious as crazy as that sounds. So I think for him, he was very insecure about the role he was in there. And he talked a big game about his father. He was so proud of his dad. How could he not be? But then when he actually got there on the ground and had lost some friends, he came home from his first tour of duty. And, my family didn't have a lot of money. There was 5 kids in a 3-bedroom house. So all the kids shared rooms, all the boys. My mom was the only one that got her own room. Um, my Uncle Kim, who was the youngest, described his brother coming home and sharing the bed that night. He woke up, his brother was kicking and screaming and clawing at the air, saying some words I'm not going to repeat, but was clearly reliving something he had seen. And it scared the shit out of my uncle. He was like 16 at the time. And then he went back. He didn't have to go back. He wasn't conscripted the second time. He volunteered. I think he felt like he had to go back there for the people he had lost. There was a mission he had to complete. Um, and unfortunately, he never came home. Um, yeah. I think
And
it was trying to be his father. And then by the end, I think when he was at home, especially how Vietnam vets were received at the time, he just didn't feel like he could settle in anywhere to this suburban small house with his, like, teen siblings. I think he had to go back to um, what he had become to know as normal life, which was going up in the sky every night in the cover of darkness and not knowing if it come back down, that thrill, that high. Um, but that was his reality that he lived in even once he was home, and he never really came home mentally.
yeah, Donald wanted to ask also about uh, the title of your book and the origin of the title. I think it's a very beautiful title. I think everything we've talked about really exemplifies the title of your book. Um, has it always been the title of your book? How many titles have you gone through before coming upon this one?
I got this pretty early on, and you usually never get to keep it, but I was, like, ready to fight for it because, we're feisty fighter families, like, we're very, into getting things out there, and, yeah, my editor was so into it, and I think the reason I loved it so much was, what we inherit, there's this idea of, like, I have my mother's eyes, I hear that all the time, which is a compliment, but it's also a source of pain sometimes when you just miss someone so much that you can't speak, right? There's this sense of the things that we're most proud of, like a sense of humor or a sense of tenacity that we can be proud of, but there's also maybe some unhealthy patterns. I'm a mom now, and I'm very conscious of the things I inherited from my mother I'm not so proud of. When your kid does something wrong and you feel that boiling in your chest, you're like, I sound like my mother. So it's, yeah, what we inherit. It's patterns of um, behavior, but it's also patterns of grieving. Like my uncle went up into that plane wanting to be his father. I spent years wanting to be my mom. Just like she wanted to be a journalist and an editor, gave it up to have kids. I'm a journalist, I'm an editor. And it's like, where does my mom end and I begin? And so for me, this whole book is an examination of those family patterns of behavior. And I guess a deeper way of looking at it too, when my mom was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, she told us she was going to live, and we believed her because mom is a fighter and mom believed herself. And when my grandfather said, "Your brother is missing, but I'm gonna bring him home," we believed him because grandpa's a superhero World War II vet, and he can, his word is bond. And like my grandfather died thinking his son was still living. And when we buried my anyway, then there's, I don't want to give too much away, but there's this sense of not letting go that can also lead to um, passing down some of that trauma, and I really wanted a lot of it to kind of end with me as well. So what we inherit played on a lot of levels, both positive and negative for me. And the cover too, we can talk about that for a hot second.
Yes. Oh
You
my
can
goodness.
see
I wanted to ask you about that. It's such an unusual cover. It took me a bit to fully process it. It's almost like an optical illusion.
yes, yeah, and it's originally my publisher was like, the artist doesn't know what to do. We just can't come up with anything for it. So we actually went to a second artist who had a very strong and I think awesome vision. It's my uncle's plane by night, which the night it was shot down, it's a starry sky, it's the actual plane, and then it morphs into a dragonfly. Dragonflies are a very big symbol in the book of hope, of renewal, of connection, on a clear day. And then my editor actually surprised me when she printed the book. If you open up the paper flap, there's actually a beautiful butterfly, I mean, a dragonfly in there too.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I see.
Once you read the book, you kind of get the wink and nod that
Yeah.
but I thought that was very thoughtful. And the book is told from two perspectives. It's a life kind of torn down the middle. Um, yeah, the lightness in the dark, but it's the darkness going towards the light, which I think is also very significant.
Wow.
Yeah.
You talk about your grandfather a lot in the book, of course, from his perspective, like you mentioned. And I think you have a little excerpt for us to read about your grandfather.
He was 19 years old when he enlisted in the Air Force, or I guess the Army Air Corps at that time. And he has this description of being shot down that's in his own perspective, pretty much. So I frame it and then we'll go right in. But this really kind of shows you the kind of man he was. And this is the experience that Jack was honestly raised hearing about. Okay. Ed's B-17 was one of 351 Allied planes sent to bomb Schweinfurt, Germany on October 14th, 1943. The heavily defended city was home to multiple factories supplying Nazi troops. Ed's plane was nicknamed Patches for the number of repairs it had undergone, an appearance that belied the valuable cargo it carried. The bomb site that would direct all the other Allied planes that day where to drop their payload. Only the first 3 bombers that morning had one on board. It was the equivalent of holding the flag as you charged the front lines. Most of the anti-aircraft fire was concentrated upon our plane. My grandfather wrote 45 years to the day of being shot down. The Germans quickly hit their mark. We sustained 3 direct hits from AA shells, knocking out most of our power and including a large hole in our wing tank. We managed to drop our bombs on the target even though we had a severe gasoline leak. My grandfather watched the bombs fall thousands of feet below, along with the gasoline streaming rapidly from his plane. As we turned back toward France after leaving the target, we were swarmed by enemy fighters. We soon caught fire and the order was given to bail out. We were over 23,000 feet high at the time, and none of us had ever received parachute training, and we did not have our parachute harnesses on tight enough. Ed had been rushed out to the war at 19, deployed so quickly that there hadn't been time to teach him what he was now being ordered to do. His hands shook as he tried to fasten the buckles before diving toward the earth, the smoke from burning gasoline stinging his eyes. The Germans herded them like sheep in the sky, and all Grandpa Ed could do was watch as hundreds of white spots clotted the sun. I was looking up at the chute instead of the ground when I hit because I wasn't trained, and I was injured again. He dislocated his jaw when he fell, his mouth stuck open in awe at the death all around him. 63 other US planes were shot down that day, though the Germans fared worse. 182 of 184 German fighters were shot down in one of the largest air raids in history. He came to in a German field, and then I talk about when he was brought to Stalag 17 in boxcars on a day and night journey. In his prison ID photo, my grandfather's dark hair is tousled and parted to the right, bangs sweeping across his forehead, kind of like now. Um, Beneath his wild hair, his light eyes stare directly at the camera like the eyes of dead men in Civil War battleground photos. He'd later tell us that he had tried to cover his face as much as possible in case he had the chance to escape. And you can kind of see some of that there. He spent the next 2 winters in the unheated barracks of Stalag 17B, the prison that would later be the namesake for the 1953 Billy Wilder movie. His ration of food was a small portion of soup a day and a small piece of black bread. Each prisoner was given an aluminum spoon. At the time, my grandfather thought that if he ever got out, he'd never want to see that damn spoon again. But once the camp was liberated, he found he couldn't leave the thing behind. It was a reminder of all the sorry meals he'd eaten with it that kept him alive. In the 19+ months we spent there, I can remember only 3 hot showers. The barracks themselves were built over a crawl space, and during the winter, snow would blow under and come up between the cracks on the floor. Those of us who lost our boots bailing out were particularly exposed to frostbitten feet. Even as an old man, my grandfather's feet bothered him. They'd tingle and then lose feeling. Like his daughter during chemo decades later, he never felt truly warm. And I'll stop.
You
Grandpa.
write such, yeah, you write such beautiful descriptions of your grandfather and your grandmother, almost as if you were there with them. Where do you pull that imagery from?
My grandfather was such a storyteller. I mean, the man could, once he started talking, it could be 2 or 3 hours and you'd still be like stuck in the story. He was phenomenal. And, once his son was shot down, he quit his job as a state police officer and traveled the country on kind of a speaking circuit about his son. They had no money. It was a crazy thing to do, but he was just fired up. And what an incredible public speaker he was. I have all this video and footage of him with his Pennsylvania twang, which I can't really replicate. It's amazing, his accent. And when he got passionate, there was just nothing that could stop him. So I had the memories of him as a small child telling stories, sitting on his lap. And then my grandmother was just an incredible record keeper. I mean, I have thousands of pages to look through because like homegirl did not get rid of anything. I literally had on the back of one of the declassified CIA documents in her pencil handwriting on the back, there was the hand totaled proceeds from a bake sale she had had to raise funds for a march she was doing on Washington. It was like banana bread, $2. Like she kept that. So there was this richness. I mean, they were both very strong characters too. She was very loud and very funny and very her. Yeah, I can just hear their voices all the time. And I think writing about people, is also helpful because there is that sense of cadence and language and mannerisms that the minute I think of them, I can see them walking around the room again. Yeah.
Yeah, you really paint such vivid images of both of them. And especially there were descriptions of your grandfather when he heard the news
Mhm.
about your uncle and your grandmother too. And that was just so powerful. And then the imagery of them driving for hours to this trial in the midst of so many other life events occurring around them.
My mom was planning her wedding, which she had delayed multiple times because she wanted her brother to be her walk her down the aisle with her dad. And yeah, my grandfather wrote multiple letters to my mom from the road about his hemorrhoids as he was going on this trip. So it's like not only this high level, this trial was to declare his son dead, and then the family would get a lump check. And my grandfather was like, "You ripped that check up. My son is alive. You don't have any proof of his body. Like, we're gonna find him." So Yeah, it was just crackling with emotion, and his signature humor, he was talking about his bells as well. So a lot of color to work with as a writer. I come from colorful people. Yeah.
Wow. Wow. What are some of the feedback to because your book's been out for several years now. So um
Including me and talking about it with me.
yeah, yeah, of course. Yes, I'm curious as to, what response you've received and have you heard other stories from other people?
Yeah, I think that's the most incredible thing. Like before this book, I'd never heard of Legacies of War, and finding that group and volunteering with them has really given a sense of purpose and healing to me that I even beyond what I've done with the book. Danae, who's on here tonight, works at Legacies, and her mom, I'll let her tell her story another time. It's not mine to tell, but is from Laos, and she lost her as well. And so there's this sense of sisterhood really in uncovering who our mothers were. That's been really incredible as a friendship. Um, Rebecca, who's on here tonight, is in a writing group of mine, and her brother was in the military. Her first book was a nonfiction book about his PTSD and his recovery from that and his journey towards healing. So I think this book has brought a lot of deeply in sick people into my heart and into my life. Um, and yeah, and I think the cool thing is for me too, my sons were born. My first son was born in 2021, the second in 2022. My book came out in 2020. A lot of big, important milestones in my life that are usually when you're surrounded by family. I didn't have a certain family members to begin with. It was always going to be a little lonely, but then the pandemic happened during it too. So this unexpected the pandemic shut down the 10-city tour. There was a lot of sadness initially that the typical thing that I'd been just dreaming of my whole life wasn't going to happen. But I got to do a lot of more intimate Zooms like this, where, because you're not on a stage and speaking one directionally at people, you're kind of more in dialogue and conversation. People were, dialing in a Zoom room from bed. I could see their kids in the background. There was this intimacy, and I think it allowed for a more direct line of questioning. Like the fact that you were able to share about what's going on with your family right now is really important to me. That isn't writing someone about loss. You're not just writing about your own loss. You're writing this and putting it out there in the world because other people will come and connect to it. It's this superpower that books have, which you clearly know as a director of the library. But that's been the most magical thing, is that this book lives on. It's not just my family living on, it's connecting with other people. And one last thing, I wrote a piece for the Boston Globe about this. It was so cool. During the pandemic, I started receiving bracelets in the mail. A big scene in the book is when soldiers went missing during Vietnam. There was this group that put together bracelets with the soldier's name, missing date. And when the soldier was found, the tradition was you mailed the bracelet back to the family. People would read my book, strangers all over the country, and start sending me the bracelets they had worn when they were in their teenage years, in their 20s, and had in their jewelry boxes for all these decades. My cousin's son was just born, and they named him Jack after Jack Pearce. And now he has his own Jack bracelet as well. So it things come full circle. This bracelet that was on a stranger's hands is now back in the hands of the family because of Jack and his story.
Wow, that's beautiful. And and you're right, the pandemic, there's a silver lining to every situation. So life is just so unexpected. And um, I think for us at the library, it's opened up another way to reach out to people.
Digital events at all before the pandemic, or is this a pandemic started tradition?
Yes, it started with the pandemic. Um, People ask sometimes if we are, just doing virtual programs now. And the funny thing is that the result has been we are doing more programs
Mm.
than prior to the pandemic. Before it was in-person programs, and now it's in-person and virtual. So we're working twice as hard. The people they always ask me if, oh, are you just getting rid of your in-person programs, just doing virtual? I'm like, no, we're doing them in addition to our in-person programs.
It's so important for accessibility too. Like, people
Yeah,
that maybe aren't as mobile, like over long distances. Like we have so many people from around the country here tonight, which is so exciting and moving.
yeah,
I'm an exhausted mom and I have two kids asleep upstairs. And like, I don't know if I could have made out to the library at this late on a weeknight, but because my kids are upstairs and my husband is amazing, I can be in my living room talking to you. And there's this sense of, yeah, this just opens up a lot of conversations that were previously in kind of privileged rooms. I lived in New York City for 15 years. One of the biggest perks was all the bookstores and all the events. And COVID was kind of equalized the playing field for a lot of people who love books and want to be part of those discussions. It's so exciting.
Yeah, yeah. If anyone here has any further questions for Jessica, feel free to put them into the Q&A. We'll definitely address them. Jessica, what is your, actually, you know what? You have another passage to read, don't you? You have one more passage.
Or skip it, whatever you think. I know we're good
Okay.
if there are
Yeah.
questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In fact, your last passage, I think, is closer to the end of the book. So for those who haven't read the book, maybe we want to save it for, folks when you do read the book.
I do want to shout out, it's also available as an audiobook. I promise I talk more slowly on the audiobook than I do right now. But I know some people
Oh,
are audiobook people. I just recently discovered them during the pandemic, and I think they're delightful. So
I
also,
do listen to audiobooks all the time, and I say, and I have listened to parts of your book, and it's been a pleasure to hear your voice.
I recorded that thing the week before New York City shut down. It was February 2020. What a time. So I'm so lucky. If I hadn't been in the studio that week, it wouldn't have happened. So it's kind of I listen to it while with a moment in time. You can hear moments of panic or I can hear moments of panic in my voice, like thinking what's happening, what's going on. Living through history while writing about history is strange.
Yeah. Yeah. Was there any other question of anyone else reading your book, or was it no, of course you have to read your book?
I talked to my agent. I really wanted to do it. I think there are so many professionals that could have done a more polished job, but I think because it was such a personal story, I really wanted to do it. And I will also say part of my writing process is reading passages aloud because I think flow and lyricism is important to me. Like I actually need to hear it have a certain rise and fall as the emotions are going. But reading it in that dark room, knowing bad things were about to happen, and it just like, I don't know, like speaking as my grandfather, like those passages I read to you now, I can read them now because I've had lots of practice, but it was really hard to do in that moment because it was also this magic of like, I'm an author now and I'm telling my family's story and what a privilege that is. It was just an awareness of all of this decade of hard work and my family's 4 decades of struggle. Like it was being recorded and it felt like it had left my body finally, like recording it out loud, took it out of my chest where it had been kind of sitting. It was incredibly freeing.
It was the parts I've listened to were wonderful. And it was just so nice when I saw that it was available and I saw that it was you reading. I was like, oh, this is great. This is great. Because I sometimes do both as with this book. I listen and I read it in print. And sometimes there's a disconnect when it's a more personal story and then the narrator is a professional narrator. So,
And I also love like the Overstory by Richard Powers, like the
oh
narration
yeah.
voices are so good. I don't know, what are your favorites right now in audiobook land?
Oh, you know what? I have to say, I love Circe by Madeline Miller. It was our last big read book, and I have to admit that I struggled at first getting into it, but then I listened to the audiobook and then it eased me into it. And then it just welcomed me, gave me like a perspective. Sometimes you just can't grasp the voice of a
Mm.
novel
And that
quite
is
so
such
much in your
voice
head.
of this immortal, right? Like, wow.
Yeah. Yeah, but then the narrator of that, which she had a British accent, but it wasn't quite British. It wasn't, she toned it down a bit and it was like this ethereal voice that really worked for me and allowed me to say, okay, I believe this character exists.
Although conversely, I think my husband's actually a big proponent of this, that there's a voice he just can't get with. He just will not listen to the audiobook. He's like, oh, I love the story, but I can't do it. So it makes a difference. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I think I give myself about 5 to 10 minutes. And if I just can't get into it from the audio, then I know that I've given it a shot. So so Jessica, what are you doing now? In your bio, there was some talk of you writing a fictional work.
I hope it doesn't take 10 years because I ain't got that kind of time. But yeah, it's a book born of the pandemic and being pregnant during the pandemic about a mother and daughter living in isolation um, off the coast of New England, this very insular community. A hurricane comes, disaster strikes, and then it moves to present day. I love multiple complicated timelines, apparently, where another hurricane is coming and there's a newcomer to the island. And as the waters like rise and rise and rise, all the old interconnected New England families are forced to take shelter together in one of the oldest houses, highest ground on the island. And over the course of that night, um, stories start coming out about what really happened during that first storm. So I'm realizing the more I talk about it, the more it's very similar to my first book, and that it's like, oh, secrets and two timelines and trauma and people. Anyway, but it's the stuff that really moves me as a reader and a writer is just, um, yeah, stories that have intertwined timelines. I love that. I love a little mystery. It's a little more commercial than this one. It's a strong female voice. I'm very excited. It's so freeing to be able to write fiction. It's scary, but it's also after 10 years of deep, deep research, it's been super fun. I'm enjoying it.
Wow. Is this your first fiction work then that you're working on?
Novel. And I was lucky enough to be at Breadloaf this past summer and some other really cool writing conferences like Siren Land, where I met Rebecca. So a few select people have seen it so far, but the workshopping has been so helpful, and I hope to have it see the light of day sometime. I don't want to jinx it, but I'm very personally excited about it.
It sounds really exciting. I mean, from what we inherit, and just aspects of the similarities that you've described with the
Daughter.
secret.
Yes. Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, keep us apprised. I always want to follow up with authors after I interview them, because I want to make sure that whatever work they have out next, that we can promote it. We can talk to them about it too.
She hold me accountable. I feel like the more I talk about it in public, the more I have to actually write the damn thing. So this is good. This is accountability.
Good pressure, right? Yes. Yeah. So everyone, Jessica is actually going to join our book club. We have a Zoom book club that meets regularly, and our next one is 2 weeks from now. I think it's Thursday. Let's see, let me check. Thursday, November 7th at 2 p.m. via Zoom. And Jessica will be joining us for the last 10 to 15 minutes of our book discussion. And we will be discussing what we inherit. So if any of you want to talk to Jessica directly and have some lively conversation in 2 weeks, feel free to join us. If you go to our website, penningtonlibrary.org, and go to our book club section, you can register there. Yeah.
I just wanted to put in the comments to legaciesoфwar.org. That's the organization I mentioned earlier in the night that we didn't get to talk about too much. But if you want to learn more about the war in Laos and ways you can kind of become involved in this issue, please check them out. They're incredible.
That's wonderful. Jessica, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and just having this heart to heart has been so meaningful for me.
Happy thinking of your mother-in-law and your family and holding her in my heart. Like, thank you for having me tonight. And I know this isn't the easiest book to read when you're going through things, and I extra appreciate your thoughtful questions and the honor to speak with you today. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Well, good night, everybody. And, we'll see you soon on Zoom again. Thank you again, Jessica.
Bye.
Bye-bye.